We are at Genesis chapter 15, and we're moving into the covenant made with Abraham. Way back when, there was a minister at this Presbyterian church by the name of Andrew W. Blackwood. That's probably so long ago that most people wouldn't have any idea who that was. If you find the picture of the old pastors in the church, he is there. After he left First Presbyterian Church, Columbia, he eventually ended up at Princeton Theological Seminary, and at that time was probably the best-known Presbyterian minister in the country, most especially for preaching, which he taught, but also for the books on pastoral ministry, which he wrote. Books on funerals and pastoral care and a number of books on preaching, this, that, and the other. He was kind of your quintessential pastor, and he taught pastoral ministry and had all these books on it. Dr. Connect had been able to study with Blackwood after he retired at Princeton. He taught for a while at the Conwell School of Theology when it was in Philadelphia. And Glenn was pastor not too far from Philadelphia, so he went in to Philly to study with the great, at that time, Andrew W. Blackwood, whose name everybody would have known in the church at that time, the Presbyterian church anyway. So Glenn got to go there, and Glenn used to quote him frequently to us for one thing or another on the staff. But one of the things he said about preaching has stuck with me. He said, when all the study has been done and all the notes have been taken, the key to good preaching is knowing what to leave out and having the courage to do it. That's the great temptation for ministers. As you dig into the Holy Scriptures, there's just so much that pops out. And the deeper you dig, the more comes out. It's a wonderful thing. You never exhaust the Holy Scriptures. If you'll keep working at it, more will come. But once you get it, you can't put it all out there. You can't have people coming in there drinking water out of a fire hose every week. It doesn't happen. And that's kind of where I am this morning when it comes to the Abrahamic covenant. There is just so much here. So I'm trying to keep in mind, I want you to be keeping in mind, the purpose for studying this right now is to prepare us for a study of the Ten Commandments, which will be our main study for the course of the year. It's really not intended as a basic overview of covenant theology. We're doing that, but we're using as our guiding star in this what we need from covenant theology to prepare us for a study of the Ten Commandments, because we won't really understand them if we don't understand them in the covenant which God has made. So we've come up into a section of Genesis dealing with Abraham. We move quickly to Genesis chapter 15 because this is the first chapter where the word covenant is used with God's dealings with Abraham. We talked about the word covenant itself first appears in Genesis 6:18, though there were covenants before Genesis 6:18. Particularly the covenant of works, which God made with Adam and Eve, unfallen, in the Garden of Eden. Then the covenant of grace, which is inaugurated with Adam and Eve after the fall. We have covenants. We know that because after the concept is introduced, and especially after the concept is, one might say, fully explained and expounded in the Holy Scriptures, then on the basis of the fuller information we get later, we can look back into the Scriptures and see, oh, that was a covenant. Moses didn't tell us that at the time, but that is a covenant. We see it clearly later on. In the case of Genesis chapter 15, however, I think it's important that we understand that up to this time with Abraham, he did not have a covenant with God. He had a promise from God. And it's the distinction between those two things that will occupy us here this morning. But I first want to read a portion of Genesis chapter 15, most of it actually, to see how the word comes up in what kind of circumstances. Then we're going to jump into the New Testament to Hebrews chapter 6, which becomes our flashlight to go back into Genesis chapter 15 to understand what's going on. Genesis 15 at verse 1. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he, that is Abram, believed Yahweh, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, and Yahweh said to him, I am Yahweh, who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. But, he said, O Lord Yahweh, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and deep darkness fell upon him. Then Yahweh said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. And afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. All right. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. Hebrews chapter 6 reflects back upon this passage. It quotes Genesis chapter 22, which builds upon this passage, but I think principally Hebrews chapter 6, beginning at verse 13, is looking back to this passage. Verse 13, Hebrews chapter 6. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, Surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement. to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. We started our reading in Genesis chapter 15, and it's in Genesis chapter 14 when this great man, Melchizedek, who occupies several chapters in the book of Hebrews, appears briefly, disappears, shows up again in Psalm 110 briefly, then disappears, and then somehow or other becomes the subject of a major portion of the sermon that stands behind the letter to the Hebrews. Only 2 appearances. And yet his priesthood is so very significant because it is after that priesthood that the priesthood of Jesus Christ is patterned in the New Testament. The author of Hebrews telling us that Jesus is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That's for another time and place. All right. Hebrews chapter 6. God desired to show in a more convincing way, or we could translate this word in Hebrew, to make more firm the promise that he made to Abraham. God was desiring to show in a more convincing way to the heirs of the promise. So, he's showing this to people who have already received a promise. They had a promise from God. And it says later in this passage that in promises, it is impossible for God to lie. So if you have a promise from God, you need nothing else. It's impossible for him to break his promise. For God to break a promise, he'd have to cease to be God. His promise grows right out of who he is. And his character is immutable. So were God to break a promise, then of course he would have changed. He can't change. Everything about God is permanent in his characteristics. So if he gives us a word at one point in time, he's giving us his word at every point in time. It is impossible for God to lie. And yet, the God who gives this promise, in which it is impossible for him to lie, desired to show in a more convincing way to the heirs of the promise, to the people who had already received his promise, he desired to show them in a more convincing way the unchangeable character of his purpose. Now, why would he do that? It's not, as we've already made clear, it's not because his promise is weak. It's impossible for his promise to fail. So why does he desire to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose? It's not because his promise is weak. It's because their faith is weak. They need to be convinced more firmly. They need to be established more securely in the promise of God. His promise is all that they need. But it's not enough for them in the weakness of their flesh. Now in Genesis chapter 15, it's quite clear that Abraham is a man of faith. It's in this chapter, verse 6, that the fundamental verse of salvation, you might say, is given to us because it's quoted in Paul's letter to the Romans, in Paul's letter to the Galatians, and it even gets quoted by James in his epistle. Abraham believed God. He believed Yahweh, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Abraham is a man of faith in Genesis chapter 15, and he is a man of saving faith in Genesis chapter 15. He believed Yahweh, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And yet if you look at the context, you'll also see that this is a struggling faith. God comes to Abraham. God speaks to Abraham. God appears to Abraham and says to him, I am Yahweh. I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it, or your reward shall be very great. And Abraham responds to God, not by saying, thank you very much. I look forward to this every day. He responds to it with a question. He says, Lord, what will you give me? In other words, what can you possibly give me, seeing that I have no son? Right now, were I to die, the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, a servant, not possibly a slave that he had bought in Damascus. That's the most senior person in Abraham's house that would carry on the property, the name, and all that stuff. And God says to Abraham, this man will not be your heir. Your own son will be your heir. And then he takes Abraham out underneath the stars, if they were inside at the time or where this happened. But he probably has that. Now look at the stars above. Count them. Count them if you can. Because that's how many descendants you will have. And that's where Abraham responds with belief. But not with belief that is untainted by doubt, or let us call it at least weakness. God, after Genesis 15:6, after the great affirmation that Abraham has faith, reiterates now the promise, not only of the seed, but of the land. I am Yahweh. I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. Abraham is living in a land where he's a stranger and an alien. He doesn't own anything at this point in time. And again, the man of faith answers with a question. How shall I know? How am I to know? And then God makes the covenant. Now bring me a 3-year-old heifer. Bring me a 3-year-old ram. These animals are brought, and apart from the birds, the turtle dove and the pigeon, they're cut in half. And one side is laid over against the other, creating a channel in between, something like a gauntlet, you might say. And then in the dreadful darkness that fell at that time, God shows up in a theophany, an appearance of God, with a smoking pot, like a kettle, okay, that you'd make a low country boil in or something like that, a big pot, which apparently is boiling, and the smoke is going up from it. He's got fire there. And then a flaming torch. So you got a fire going up, a flame of fire, no doubt, going up from this torch. And you've got this pot with smoke going up, fire and smoke, just like the later revelation at Sinai when God shows up with fire and smoke. And God passes between the pieces of the animals. And as this ceremony unfolds before Abraham, God speaks these words. Verse 13 in Genesis 15. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. And he promises them the land. He explains that right now the land is not theirs because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. They have not ripened unto judgment. While they are ripening unto judgment, Abraham's descendants are going to be slaves down in the land of Egypt. But when the Amorites have ripened and the time has come, God will bring them out and he will give them this land. And this ceremony is done for the purpose that Abraham might know for certain that these things are so. Hebrews chapter 6 is picking up on that idea. God desired to show more convincingly, or God desired to show in a way they could know for certain the unchangeable character of God's purpose. Now we have one other passage in Scripture that speaks of a ceremony like this, and it helps us to understand what is going on. That is Jeremiah chapter 34. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms of the earth under his dominion, and all the peoples were fighting against Jerusalem and all of its cities. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, go and speak to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and say to him, thus says Yahweh, behold, I am giving this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. You shall not escape from his hand, but shall surely be captured and delivered into his hand. You shall see the king of Babylon eye to eye, and speak with him face to face, and you shall go to Babylon. Yet, hear the word of Yahweh, O Zedekiah, king of Judah. Thus says Yahweh concerning you, you shall not die by the sword. You shall die in peace. And as spices were burned for your fathers, the former kings who were before you, so people shall burn spices for you and lament for you, saying, alas, Lord, for I have spoken the word, declares Yahweh. Then Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah, king of Judah, in Jerusalem, when the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, Lachish and Azekah, for these were the only fortified cities of Judah that remained. The word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh after Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to make a proclamation of liberty to them, that everyone should set free his Hebrew slaves, male and female, so that no one should enslave a Jew his brother. They had not been doing that. They had been prophesied against because they hadn't obeyed God's law and so on. So now, when things are desperate, when the king of Babylon is breathing down their necks and so on, they decide, well, maybe we should set our slaves free. So they do that. The king requires this of them. And verse 10 says, and they obeyed. And all the officials and all the people who had entered into the covenant. Zedekiah made this a covenant with them. Everyone would set free a slave, male or female, so that they would not be enslaved again. They obeyed and set them free. But afterward, they turned around and took back the male and female slaves they had set free and brought them into subjection as slaves. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I myself made a covenant with your fathers when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, saying, at the end of 7 years, each of you must set free the fellow Hebrew who has been sold to you and has served you for 6 years. You must set him free from your service. But your fathers did not listen to me or incline their ears to me. You recently repented and did what was right in my eyes by proclaiming liberty, each to his neighbor. And you made a covenant before me in the house that is called by my name. But then you turned around and profaned my name when each of you took back his male and female slaves, whom you had set free according to their desire. You brought them into subjection to be your slaves. Just pause for a minute. How do they profane God's name? In the making of a covenant, God's name is invoked. It's like our marriage ceremonies to this day. We make our promise and covenant. Ministers may use various books. I always use the 1946 book of Common Worship in the Presbyterian Church for marriage ceremonies. And which, by the way, was very much influenced by Andrew W. Blackwood. The vows that the husband and wife are to make during the wedding ceremony, keep them, and these are vows to be made to God. We usually have them stand and face one another because, yes, they are making these vows to one another, but these vows mainly concern one another. The vow is made to God. Vows are always made to God. And It's I, Wayne, take thee, Donna, to be my wedded wife, and I do promise and covenant before God and these witnesses. We bring both those words in, and you'll understand more why in a minute. I do promise and covenant. Well, they have made a promise and covenant before God to set their slaves free. Then it's not long before they turn around and they break their covenant, and they make the slaves come back. Now God is judging them for violating the covenant, because when you bring God into the matter, you are saying that what you are now promising is just as certain as the Word of God. And when you violate your vow, then you are impugning the character of God, because he had been asked to co-sign your vow. So when you break the vow, you bring him into a breaking of the vow. That's how we profane his name. We represent him to the world as a covenant breaker. All right, verse 17. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, you have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, everyone to his brother and to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim to you liberty to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine, declares Yahweh. I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. And the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the parts of the calf. And I will give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of those who seek their lives. Their dead bodies shall be food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. And Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his officials, I will give into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of those who seek their lives, and into the hand of the army of the king of Babylon, which has withdrawn from you. Behold, I will command, declares the Lord, and will bring them back to this city, and they will fight against it, and take it and burn it with fire. I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. All right, so in this, we get, one might say, a little clearer picture of what this all means. When they passed between the pieces, they were making a vow unto the Lord to do what he had commanded them to do, namely to release their slaves. In passing between the pieces of the animals, they were invoking a curse upon themselves for any future violation of the covenant. They're now, one might say, giving up their lives unto this covenant, because if they prove unfaithful to the covenant, then they will suffer the same fate that happened to that calf. They will be cut in half by the sword. They will be given over to the birds of prey in the air. They will die. So in the making of this covenant, their life had been made the pledge for their faithfulness. They were backing up their promise with a covenant by giving their lives as the bond or the pledge, or you might say the earnest of their word. Years ago, Warren and Kathy Harvey, Warren's now an ARP minister up in eastern North Carolina. Warren's the brother of Helen Lafitte in our congregation, if you know Helen. Warren and Kathy lived next to us, and they had been through seminary. Our church was supporting them, and Warren had now graduated. He was looking for a 2-year internship in church planning, and finally found one up in Charlotte. And they had been, over the course of months, trying to locate a house to live in Charlotte, just rent, because they're just going to be there 2 years before they would find a place as a church planter. So they had looked, and they had looked, and they had looked, and the apartment market up there was rather short, plus they had 3 boys. at that point in time, and so not every apartment would be suitable, especially for 2 years with 3 boys. So they had looked and they had looked and they had looked. And finally, they decided they would make one more, what at that time appeared to be the last trip that they would make to Charlotte. And if they didn't find something, they might have to give up on that internship because they had not been able to find any place to live. And Warren didn't particularly want to commute from Columbia for a church planting internship in Charlotte. So they went up, and in the providence of God, they found the best house that they had seen up to this point in time. It was kind of a townhouse. And right next to it was a park big enough for 3 boys. It was just perfect in every way. So they looked at that and they told the owner of the place, we want it. He said, well, that's wonderful. He said, I've actually got 3 people in front of you. He said, I haven't made a choice, but there are 3 people in front of you. You just need to know that. And Warren said, well, that's fine. He said, but we really want it. So here's $1,000. I want, this is our down payment on, rent, etc. Here's $1,000. He said, no, you don't need to do that. He said, well, I got to think this through, and I have to choose one, but I've got 4 of you, and so on. And Warren said, I want you to know that if you pick us, we are going to take this. Here is $1,000. And I was back in a time when $1,000 went a little further than it does in this economy. And so he put, the guy said, you really don't have to do it. He said, look, I want you to know. He said, if you choose somebody else, just destroy the check. I said, okay. So he put the check in his pocket. Well, Warren was off to do something else with the church. Kathy had driven up by herself. She was coming back with the boys. And all the way back, she's telling the boys, we have got to pray that God will give us this apartment. We've got to. We don't have any other place where we can live. This is it. This is the only thing we've seen that is available, and it would be perfect for us. So we've got to pray. So she did that the whole way from Charlotte down to Columbia. No sooner do they pull in the driveway in our neighborhood in Columbia, while they're getting out of the car and into the house, the phone rings. And Kathy goes running into the house, and it's the owner of the apartment. He says, it's yours. He made his choice. And she comes running back out, and she said, boys, we got the apartment. God gave us the apartment. And Whit, the oldest boy, just kind of looked at her strange. He looked at the kitchen, and he looked at her. He said, was that God on the phone? He thought God had called to tell them they had the apartment. But they had put down the earnest money. They wanted to show more convincingly to the owner of the townhouse the unchangeable character of their purpose. So they put up $1,000 of earnest at the time. When an ancient covenant was made, you didn't put up $1,000. You didn't put up $10,000. You put up your life. You invoked upon yourself the curse of death should you prove to be unfaithful to your word. House 2 doors over from me is on the market right now. People would put down a contract on it. They changed their mind. They lost $1,000 in the process. You make an ancient covenant, you change your mind. You die. And that's what's going to happen to the officials of Judah during this period of time. They're going to lose it all. The whole city, the land, the temple, and for most of them, their lives. Zedekiah will lose his eyesight. He will see his 5 sons put to death by the king of Babylon as his last vision of this world. Death was imposed. In Genesis chapter 15, God is invoking the curse of death upon himself. God is the only one that passes between the pieces of the animal. Abraham stands apart and watches this. But it's only God who is invoking the curse, because God is desiring to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose. Now we see the difference between the promise and the covenant. God made a promise, and in that promise it is impossible for God to lie. If God were to break that promise, and of course it's impossible that it would happen, so we're thinking contrary, not just to fact, but the possibility here. Were God to do it, he would lose his reputation. That's what would happen to us if we gave somebody a promise and then we turned back on it. We reveal ourselves to be somebody who can't be trusted. Your word is not your bond. You're not worth trusting because you make promises that you don't keep. But when that promise becomes a covenant, when you say you sign a document where you're making that promise, then there are penalties that may be imposed upon you. In this day and age, it's not the penalty of death, but you can be sued for breach. If you were promising to do something and you failed to do it, you could be held responsible for the doing of it. You could be forced, say, to pay for somebody else to do it because you had promised to do it. So when it becomes a legal contract, when it becomes formalized, okay, there are implied penalties. What those penalties are in our day and age would be determined by the law, and it would depend on the nature of the contract that had been laid. But in the ancient world, the penalty was death. God is backing up his promise with his life. Now, why is this necessary? Well, Abraham's faith is weak. Why is it weak? Well, in Genesis 16, we have the Ishmael thing, which is another example of the weaknesses of Abraham's faith. Genesis 16, you have the episode with Hagar and Ishmael, because Sarah's faith is getting weak as well. At the end of Genesis 16, we are told that Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. 86. Genesis 15 comes right before that. Genesis 15 is after these things. That's kind of a Hebrew idiom that means sometime later. Sometime later after Genesis chapter 14. So my guess, in round numbers, keep in mind, my guess is in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham is approximately 85 years of age, which means he has lived 10 years in the land without a single descendant being born, without possessing a single square inch of the land. And he wasn't a spring chicken when he set out on this venture. He was 75 years of age when he set out on this. And Sarah was 65 years of age. And they are already known as an infertile couple. But they went out under the promise of God that they were going to have seed. They had to leave their land. They had to leave their father's house. They had to give up everything behind them, and they had to go to the land that God would show them. And he went. And he did believe God. He believed God from the time he started this journey. But having faith doesn't mean you won't be subject to doubts or weakness. Sometimes the length of the trial or the intensity of the trial, or both together, can erode the foundations of faith. And although you believe, although you set out in faith, you're finding it difficult to maintain a steady walk with God without despair or doubt or anger or bitterness coming upon you. You may struggle against it mightily, but it's there. It's eroding the foundations of your faith. And sometimes during those trials, either due to its longevity or its intensity or both, people do what Abraham does in Genesis 16. They do an unfaithful thing to try to ease their pain and solve their problem. All right, that's creating an Ishmael in your life. That has not worked out well for Abraham or for us. Sometimes that's what happens in our faith. But in Genesis chapter 15, when Abraham expressed that weakness of his faith, God came to him. And he didn't say, now Abraham, think this through. Who do you think you're talking to? I'm God. Do you remember that? Do you remember Theology 101, God? Abraham? All right. What's the fundamental characteristic of God? All right. He is immutable. All right. Without being immutable, he can't be God. God doesn't change. So when I give you my word, it's good. Now you need to buck up here and hold fast to that word. That would have been a just response. It was not the response that he made. So God came to Abraham in the weakness of his faith. I think of Genesis 15 as your Old Testament counterpart to Mark chapter 9 and the man at the base of the Mount of Transfiguration who had the demon-possessed boy. And he had brought him to the disciples of Jesus, and they could do nothing. And then finally, when Jesus comes down from the mountain and the request is brought to him, then as the man expresses his desperation, Jesus says to him, all things are possible to him who believes. And the man says, I believe, but help thou my unbelief. The man was a believer, as Abraham was a believer, but his faith needed help, as our faith needs help from time to time. And God has provided, and all that he has commanded, resources for the strengthening of faith, because he knows that we are going to live in a world where the foundations of faith are eroded by the longevity and by the intensity of the trials that we must bear while we live in this world short of the promise. We're always short of the promise in this world. Good things happen, yes. But they're never such as to wipe away every tear from our eyes, or to leave us without any mourning or crying or pain anymore. In the world we will have tribulation. And so he provides for us. Now in Abraham's case, you see, he had this covenant ceremony. And he could think back to that very vivid experience when God showed up himself and passed between the pieces, invoking a curse upon himself to sustain his life. He looked back to the night when God pledged his life to the keeping of that covenant. You and I don't look back to that night. You and I are invited to come to the table of the Lord. And there we look back to the time when he did give his life for the fulfillment of the covenant. Because that bread is his body, which was given for us. And that cup is the blood that was shed for us. Shed for many, for the remission of sins. That no barrier stands between you and everlasting bliss when this world ends. He desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose. So he confirmed it with an oath. He made a covenant with Abraham on that day. And he fulfilled that covenant in Jesus Christ. So that, as Paul says in Galatians, if you are Abraham's offspring, if, like Abraham, you are faith, whether Jew or Gentile, if you walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, Romans 4, then you are Abraham's offspring. And you are God's offspring because you are in Jesus Christ. What he made thousands of years ago, he is now kept and fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we live with even more convincing evidence concerning the unchangeable character of his purpose. For he who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? Thanks be to God. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your covenant. That you not only pledged your life, but gave your life in order that your people might inherit life and escape the curse of death. Oh, how we pray that you will renew our faith this day, that whatever trials or tribulations we now face or will face, we will be able to hold fast to that sure and steadfast hope that has been set before us. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.